Unleash the power of your training. Welcome to How Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Drives Business Value. Here are your hosts, Frank Clark and Desiree Lackey.
Welcome to this exciting session. We're so glad that everyone has been able to join us. And now it's time to welcome our special guest. He's CEO of VIA Group, a leadership advisory and consulting firm with locations throughout the United States that focuses on delivering transformative DEI, executive search, and business strategy solutions to its clients. With extensive expertise in strategy, business development, operations, DEI, and M&A, he'll discuss how DEI drives business value and the importance of organizations being DEI ready. Please welcome Frank Clark.
Thanks, Desiree, for that wonderful introduction. I appreciate that. And the topic today, DE&I, is certainly prevalent and paramount in every corporate boardroom, every not-for-profit boardroom, every senior leadership team across the United States. And the reason being is D&I has had this illumination, if you will, over the last 2 years or so in terms of its business value drivers when it comes to results and performance. And a lot of that stems from the social unrest of a George Floyd, which happened in May of 2020, and other things that happened prior and actually subsequent to that. So now D&I is not just centered around a focus or a silo of social impact, which of course is important. It now really has this laser focus on what it's always had, which is how it drives business performance, how it drives value, how it creates differentiation, how it creates innovation, and how it creates market value. That's really the power and the formulaic impact of DE&I. And diversity is broad. And here's what we mean when we talk about diversity. It's in several different work streams and categories. We're talking about diversity of thinking, cognitive diversity. That's very important. You do not want groupthink in any corporation, particularly at the senior leadership level, and you don't want groupthink in any not-for-profit either. You want diversity of thought. That's key to driving performance and innovation. You also want diversity of gender. You want diversity of ethnicity, African-American men and women, Asian men and women, Hispanic men and women. You want diversity of ethnicity. And you also want diversity of experiences. Everyone in a financial services company or not-for-profit that's focused on STEM doesn't have to necessarily have core financial service experience. That used to be the way of thinking, but clearly all the data shows that diversity of experience also drives innovation and performance, and of course, diversity of thought. So those are some key tenets and fundamental principles around diversity. And again, the value proposition of diversity is centered around diversity drives business performance. Diversity drives creativity. Diversity drives innovation. And when you look at diversity, equity, and inclusion in the US in particular and globally, one thing that is to be aspirational and be excited about driving D&I. That's good and that's important, and that's a starting point. But just as important, and maybe even more so, is being DE&I ready. D&I readiness is key to have D&I success that's long-term and sustainable versus it being a flavor of the month or a flavor of the year. That D&I readiness is absolutely critical. So one of the things that I always consult and inform the senior executive suite is make sure you're D&I ready. And what I mean by that is in your policies, in your procedures, in some of your metrics, and even more broadly, and probably just as impactful, is the culture. Does the CEO, does the board of directors, does the chairman of the board, does the C-suite have a real deep understanding of D&I, why it's important, And can they articulate that in a way that's compelling and galvanizing throughout the company? So D&I readiness is critical to having long-term, systemic, sustainable DE&I success in a company or in an organization that is not for profit as well. That readiness is key, because that gap usually, particularly if you're new in D&I as an organization, that gap between where you are today and where you want to be is tremendous. You know, it could be as big as Mount Everest. So to kind of close that gap little by little, that readiness, which comes with training, which comes with information, which comes with assessment tools, and what comes with data and analytics is important. So that's the D&I readiness piece. And the other piece that I would mention to you is in creating this D&I culture in an organization, the safe space needs to be there, right? Because there's going to be, all of us, 99.9% of us, including me, have unconscious bias. That's how our brains are wired. So when we see someone, hear someone that's different, automatic biases come up. And it's not even intentional in many cases. In most cases, it's not malicious at all. It's how our brains are wired based on experiences, exposures, and teachings over our lifetime. So unconscious bias is going to be there with all of us. And I do mean all of us. How do you break that barrier down? You create this safe space in your culture of an open exchange to talk about unconscious bias. You know, you talk about differences. You talk about what your thought processes are in that area in a very open, what I would call transparent environment. That's how you do it. Transparency is going to be key in driving those kind of discussions. And that has to, again, stem from the CEO and the senior leadership team, and of course the boardroom, in fostering that kind of culture. And that's why training and development of D&I strategy implementation and even just open exchanges is very important, because you need to be informed. You need to have kind of the right setup of an environment to have that kind of unconscious bias discussion where people feel safe, where they're not going to be judged or penalized for having these open discussions. And you do this in bite sizes. You do this in fireside chats. You do this in town hall meetings, where it's more of a open exchange, but a small, intimate environment that can kind of scale over time. That's how you do that successfully. And the other note that I would leave you with when it comes to D&I is all of the data shows, whether it's, you know, a large consulting company or a consulting company that's boutique like ours, Via Group, all of our data shows that homogenous companies underperform those that are diverse. Diversity, again, drives ingenuity, it drives performance, it drives employee engagement, and you can attract and retain and recruit best-in-class talent because you have this culture, you have this environment that welcomes and embraces diversity and differences, including sexual orientation, including ethnicity, including diversity of thought. Those kinds of companies always outperform those that are homogenous. And if you benchmarked it in any industry, if you benchmark it in any size company or not-for-profit organization, you will see that the data comes back and tells you that and communicates that information. So with that said, I'd love to take questions and your thoughts around this very important and prolific subject matter that is going to be here for years to come.
We actually have our first question, Frank. It's from Barry. What are the challenges for companies whose customer base is not diverse?
So if your customer base is not diverse, which is unusual in today's markets, 2021, most customer bases, I'd say the lion's share are diverse, whether it be financial services, whether it be industrial, whether it be technology, B2B and B2C. Most client and customer bases are diverse. But if you are in a space where your customer base is not diverse, diversity still is going to be important because that will change over time. Again, all of the data shows that the country is becoming more and more diverse when it comes to people of color and when it comes to women as well. The country, just based on pure statistics and organic growth, is going in that direction. So it's still important to get ahead of it, even if your customer base is not diverse. And how do you do that? Again, you educate the management team, you educate the CEO, and if it has a board of directors, you educate them why it's important not just to look at things today, but look around the corner of where the market will be changing, because a customer base is not diverse today, will be diverse tomorrow.
Thank you, Frank. And Barry said, great, just great, thanks. I have a question. You have brought up about everyone faces unconscious bias. What are some ways that we can help overcome or recognize unconscious bias?
Sure. Being very self-aware that you have it. Number one, it starts there with you being very self-aware and candid with yourself, with self-introspection, where you have unconscious bias. Number one, address it there first with some private introspection time, and kind of write them down so you can see where your unconscious biases are that may be impacting your progress, may be affecting your judgment around objectivity. That's one. And then once you understand that about yourself, then you can talk about it in a safe space, if you are going back to that, in small groups of your company that's facilitated probably by a professional that can have some mediation and ask the appropriate question and create this environment of transparency in an open exchange. That is a very healthy way to do it. Again, in bite sizes, groups of 5, groups of 7, groups of 9, and then you kind of take it from there. And it becomes really a culture over time. This culture and change doesn't happen in one quarter. It may take 18, 24, 36 months for it to really permeate and cascade throughout the organization, but you make progress as you continue to drive it forward and make it a priority, make it a part of the value system, quite frankly, of the company. And it needs to be represented in the boardroom. It needs to be represented in the executive suite as well.
Frank. We have a question from Pam. How would you bring it to someone else's attention if they have it? And if it's not appropriate to bring it to their attention, how do you work around it?
Yeah, that's always the $1 million question. There are a couple ways that you can bring it to someone's attention, and you can kind of understand what their interests are and kind of stimulate their creativity, right? We've got a full brain that's focused on quantitative and analytics. And then we have another part of our brain, of course, is focused on creativity and innovation. And what I have found to really be stimulative in bringing up these unconscious bias, uncomfortable scenarios is you focus more so on someone's creativity and right side of their brain. And you talk about things that may be stimulative to them because you've gotten to know them a little bit that could be appealing to them. For instance, Frank Clark, as an example, really enjoys taking his kids to Disney, right? I enjoyed the whole experience. I enjoyed the entertainment. I enjoy the innovation and creativity that goes into Disney. And someone can kind of get to me when it comes to something that's tough to talk about, sexual orientation, by talking about something related to that entertainment environment and sexual orientation. Now, all of a sudden, my right side or my creativity side is stimulated versus me just looking at this from a quantitative perspective to kind of open up my thinking.
Thank you, Frank. Okay, we have another question, Barry. I know people who think they do not want to work with LGBTQ people for religious purposes. What to do?
Wow. So, people who know me know I can be a part-time evangelist, but for purposes of this discussion, I'm not going to tap into that side of Frank Clark. I'm going to keep it straight down the middle. And when it comes to the LGBTQ community and religious purposes, many times that's misguidance and misunderstandings. of what that is all about when it comes to your religion, whatever it may be. Because at the end of the day, all religious principles, and you can say this in a very matter of fact way, all religious principles have a cornerstone of love for all mankind. So if you're a part of the LGBTQ plus community, you're still part of the human race. And even though that's a difference than maybe someone who's heterosexual, at the end of the day, that is still great human decency, number one. And also that premise of love for all mankind, it comes into play, that fundamental principle. So because that is another human being that has a different sexual orientation than you prefer, they're still part of the human race. There still should have love and fairness and equity. And that's how you kind of break that down, just in a very fundamental, matter of fact way, without getting into all of the tenets of your religion versus someone else's. Just that fundamental principle of human decency and that individual or that group of people being a part of the human race. So we should treat them with kindness and love.
Love that, Frank. Thank you. Do we have any other questions? You can put it in the chat, or we can bring you up on stage where you can speak directly with Frank.
Hi, Frank. I actually had a question. It was kind of long to put in the chat, but one of the challenges I find with a lot of clients that I work with, they very much want to have a diverse workforce. They understand the importance and how it drives their business values. But how do they go about initially creating a safe space that welcomes diversity? Because if you're not known as that, and when I say safe space, I'm not saying they were doing anything wrong where people felt unsafe, but maybe members who identify with LGBTQ plus community, or they're part of the BIPOC community, they may not feel that is a space for them. So I know for a lot of employers, it's hard to invite that diversity into their companies. What would you suggest in that scenario?
Yes, and great question, Jenny. And to build on that question, it's about education and it's about information relative to the senior leadership team, starting there, and the board of directors, and specifically the chief executive officer. He or she must have this understanding around why it's so imperative for their business create a safe space, because that safe space is going to open up dialogue, and at the end of the day it's going to really impact employee engagement, and more importantly employee satisfaction, and even bigger recruitment of best-in-class talent, because best-in-class talent comes from the LGBTQ plus community. It comes from a diverse community of African American men and women. It comes from a diverse community of Asian men and women. It comes from a diverse group of Hispanic men and women. That's where the best talent comes from. So if your organization is sincere about performance, if your organization is real about differentiation, they will embrace this element of LGBTQ. They will embrace unconscious bias. They will embrace difficult and what I would call uncomfortable discussions, because at the end of the day, their common objective is to be best in class at what they do. And to do that, again, all of the data shows that diversity in all these categories that I just walked through always outperforms a homogenous environment. And therefore, creating that safe space, to your point, Jenny, must come from the C-suite. And that's why they have to be educated. That's why the training needs to be there for the CEO. And the board of directors and the C-suite horizontally. That training, that information, that development must be there, because what will happen with those folks in those different arenas is they'll develop empathy. And once that empathy clicks in, then that can be communicated. And people then buy into it because they see that you're sincere. They understand that you have empathy around it, and they see that you've actually done some real work internally to now have that external view and that external communication, and they buy into it, and then they become synergistic with you.
Answer. Thank you so much, because that's so hard to articulate sometimes. And I did have a follow-up. I don't want to take up other people's questions. So if others come through, Desiree, I'm not sure. But there's also a fine line between true diversity and tokenism. And I don't think the idea of tokenism is often intentional. I think in an attempt to create a diverse organization, it almost becomes a numbers game. I've got X amount of this. So how do you define true diversity versus a token gesture? And then I guess further along, I would imagine your response is probably similar about how to move past that to a very genuine openness to diversity versus having token representation.
Yeah, and that often comes up. You know, we need a woman. We need a person of color in the senior leadership team. So let's just get one. And that certainly has no sustainability, and usually that creates zero success. So one of the things that we do and have done to avoid this whole premise of tokenism versus really honing in on the true spirit of diversity and inclusion is this information, this training, and this data gathering. So people understand the long-term impact. Once the executive suite, who all generally have the same common interest, which is to drive enterprise value and to create market value for their shareholders and their stakeholders, once they really understand that diversity is going to be a real enhancer and it's going to be an extra dimension to drive those desirable outcomes, the buy-in is there, and it becomes beyond, I just need a person of color, or I just need a woman, or I just need someone from the LGBTQ plus community. It becomes much bigger than that because they understand how it impacts the entire performance, the entire market value of the organization, privately held or publicly traded. Once they really get that, their interests are aligned. You know, there's a saying, the only interest I have is my permanent interest. And permanent interests in all corporations are just what I described: market value creation, enterprise value creation. And when diversity is part of that equation and it's understood and it's really integral part of the strategy, then the tokenism is not even a discussion anymore because it becomes part of the cultural DNA, Jenny, over time. And I do mean it's a process. It's a process of training. It's a process of information. It's a process of data gathering. And then it's a process of implementation over many, many years in some cases. But you'll look up in 5 years, you've made tremendous incremental progress in that space, and you're seeing the results. You're seeing it in employee satisfaction. You're seeing it in employee retention, and you're seeing it in employee development as well. And by the way, you're now seeing it on your income statement, and on your balance sheet, and on your cash flow statement.
Thank you so much. Those are great responses. And Barry just said that you're his new hero.
I love it, Barry. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And let's see, it looks like we do have a question in the chat, Frank. Sounds like D&I readiness would have an impact in the company's training cost. What practical advice would you recommend to convince management of its positive impact in training when thinking about creating training programs?
Yeah, and that's an important question. And training is certainly important, and the training budget should be allocated for some part of D&I. And I would look at it as professional development. I would categorize D&I as a professional development training opportunity, which also is part of your leadership development, particularly if you are a leader in the company or an aspirational leader. So with companies that I work with, D&I is part of not only their training budget, but also continuous improvement methodology and thinking when it comes to the company's training and development process and methodology.
Okay, we have one from Lance Bolt. I work in a D&I wasteland. How do you get started and pique some interest?
A D&I wasteland is an interesting choice of words. And, how do you get started and pique some interest is you talk about benchmarks. So whatever company it is or organization, there are people in that, their companies, organizations in that ecosystem that you certainly can benchmark. So what I recommend doing is that benchmark them against companies that or organizations that are very DEI centric and have a real focus on DNI, and measure the performance on things like employee engagement, employee retention, employee fulfillment, and not to mention results, particularly if it's a financial driven organization around financial performances on the income statement and balance sheet. That's really what gets the attention of the C-suite, is how it's driving the financial statements, whether it be cash flow, whether it be income statement, whether it be the overall enterprise value if it's a publicly traded company, or market value. So benchmarking is important to pique interest. Benchmarking in that ecosystem of companies in the industry, companies of similar sizes, that would be a real informative and constructive exercise to pique interest. I found that to be very effective.